Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Today's webinar is being recorded. Both the recording and presentation will be available on HAC's website, www.ruralhome.org, following the webinar. So I see a few familiar names on the webinar here today. But for those of you that are not familiar with the Housing Assistance Council, just a brief overview on HAC. HAC is a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that assists local organizations with building affordable homes in rural America. With a mission to improve housing conditions for the rural poor, HAC places an emphasis on striving to serve the poorest of the poor in the most rural places. HAC emphasizes local solutions, empowerment of the poor, reduced dependence, and self-help strategies. HAC assists with the development of both single and multifamily homes and promotes homeownership for working low-income rural families through a self-help sweat equity construction method. If you're interested in learning more about HAC services or products, HAC has an office near you. Please take note of the contact numbers that are being displayed on the screen. Those numbers will also be provided as part of the handout for today's webinar. Also, please mark your calendar and join us for some upcoming trainings. We have a 502 packaging certification course that's taking place in Oswego, New York, as well as our 2016 Rural Housing Conference that's taking place in Washington, D.C. Before we move along, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Home Depot Foundation, J.P. Morgan Chase, the Wells Fargo Housing Foundation, and USDA Rural Development for their continued support of HAC's Veterans Initiative. So again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, VA Housing Resources for Heroes Part 2, an overview on the VA Specially Adapted Housing Grants Program. So now I'd like to introduce and welcome our speaker for today. He's Robert Mims. Robert began his career with the Department of Veteran Affairs in May of 2010 as a specially adapted housing agent and senior appraiser in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Subsequently, he transferred to Nashville, Tennessee, where he provided oversight on VA's loan guarantee field operations and audited lenders participating in the VA Home Loan Guarantee Program. In March of 2013, Rob transferred to Washington, D.C., where he continues to serve as a senior member of the Specially Adaptive Housing Policy staff. Rob earned his Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration from the Citadel, the military college in South Carolina, in 1989. Prior to beginning his career at VA, Rob lived in his hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, where he had 14 years of private sector experience in the construction and real estate appraisal industries. And so at this point, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Rob.
All right. Thank you, Shontaria. Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs and Loan Guarantee Service, I want to thank you all for being here. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I have a couple of polls that I'd like Shontaria to place on the screen. And if you don't mind, take a moment and answer the following questions.
All right, so our first poll that we have today is, how many of you are working with and or providing housing or other social services to veterans? Right. So the tallies are coming in, as you'll see on your screen. Looks like the good majority of participants are currently providing services to veterans. All right.
Excellent.
So I'm going to go ahead and close out that poll. And then we're going to go to the second poll that we have, just trying to gauge who our audience is today. How many of you are familiar with VA's Specially Adaptive Housing Program? All right, so the numbers are starting to come in, and they look to be the inverse of what people's experience was with serving veterans. So most participants today have very little or no knowledge of the Specially Adaptive Housing Program. We're going to go ahead and end that poll.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and as I speak, Shantaria, if you could go ahead and post the third poll question. I'll start describing our program. So the Specially Adapted Housing Grant Program is designed to improve the quality of life for our most severely disabled veterans by allowing them to live more independently in their homes. It was established in 1948, and it originally focused on veterans with total service-connected disabilities causing paralysis in the legs or the lower body. And over the years, we've had multiple legislative changes that have expanded the eligibility criteria and allowed for veterans to use the grant multiple times. It's increased the grant amounts, and most recently, it has allowed for yearly adjustments based on a cost of construction index. Because of the many program changes that we've had over the years, interest in our program has grown significantly, and as a result, the workload has grown significantly across the country as well. Just an interesting statistic, from 2014 to 2015, the number of specially adapted housing grant projects that we completed in the U.S. grew from about 950 to just over 1,800. So we had about a 100% increase in the number of projects we completed. And excuse me, so we had about a 100% increase in the number of projects completed in the United States, and we did so without increasing the number of employees needed to administer the program. So in conjunction with these program changes, we've made significant policy changes to allow for more efficient administration of our program. Within the Specially Adapted Housing Program, we have two grants, the Specially Adapted Housing Grant and the Special Housing Adaptations Grant. And I use the term grant loosely. It's not a grant in the traditional sense. It's a veteran benefit. So these grants also have a temporary component known as the Temporary Residence Adaptation Grant, which can be used to modify the home of a family member. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about each one of these programs as we go through the slide deck. So our current maximum grant amounts for the Specially Adapted Housing Grant is just under $74,000, so $73,768. Veterans who are eligible for the SAH grant and wish to use the Temporary Residence Adaptation Grant have $32,384 available to them to adapt a family member's home. Our SHA grant, the current maximum amount is $14,754, and veterans eligible for that grant may use the TRA grant up to a maximum of $5,782. VA's authority.
Rob, before you go on, could I ask you to please increase your volume? I think you dropped back a bit.
Oh, can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So VA's authority to offer this program comes from Title 38 USC Chapter 21, and this Section 2101A spells out the disability criteria for the Specially Adapted Housing Grant. This is the larger grant with the maximum amount of $73,768, and the eligibility criteria are veterans who have loss or loss of use of both lower extremities, blindness in both eyes plus loss of one lower extremity, loss or loss of use of one lower extremity together with the residuals of an organic disease or injury, or the loss or loss of use of one upper extremity, and veterans who have loss of both upper extremities at or above the elbows and certain severe burn injuries. In 2012, Public Law 112-154 expanded those eligibility criteria to include veterans who became permanently disabled after September 11, 2001, and due to the loss or loss of use of one lower extremity. And that expansion of the eligibility criteria continued in 2013, 14, and 15, and currently expires in September 30th of 2016. However, those extensions did place a cap of 30 veterans each year starting in fiscal year 14. In addition to the disability criteria that I just described, there are other requirements that veterans must meet in order to reach grant approval. First are feasibility and suitability requirements. Feasibility refers to medical feasibility and financial feasibility. Medical feasibility is, in determining medical feasibility, we decide whether or not it is medically feasible for a veteran to reside outside of a institutional setting, outside of an assisted living facility. Once their home is adapted, can they live within the housing unit that we have adapted? Financial feasibility refers to the veteran's ability to own and maintain the home based on their current or anticipated income. The suitability portion of that is related to the property itself. Is the property physically suitable for adaptations, or is it physically possible to adapt that property? There's also an ownership component. The veteran or the service member must own the property. They can own it jointly with a spouse. The most common form of ownership is fee simple ownership. Other forms of ownership might be cooperative interest, maybe a life estate, or the functional equivalent of a life estate that's created by a long-term lease. So we do have some flexibility there with how we determine ownership, but those are provided in the regulations that govern our program. We also have what we call minimum property requirements, and those are what the home must have to be considered adapted based on the statutory purpose of our program. So the areas that we focus on are the bathroom, the bedroom, and the points of ingress and egress. In the bathroom, we have requirements related to having a roll-in shower, grab bars, sufficient space for maneuvering, a wide enough door for the veteran to enter or exit the bathroom. In the bedroom, we focus on primarily means of getting in and out of the bedroom, having sufficient space for maneuvering. And with regards to points of ingress and egress, we do require 2 points. One should be either directly from the veteran's bedroom or proximate to the bedroom. This allows safe egress for the veteran in case of emergency. And the other point should be somewhere else in the home, but not necessarily egressing through a room that might have a potential fire hazard, such as a laundry room or a kitchen. The Special Housing Adaptation Grant, or the SHA grant, comes from 38 USC section 2101B and deals with veterans who have blindness in both eyes with 2200 visual acuity or less, anatomical loss or loss of use of both hands, certain respiratory ailments, and certain severe burn injuries. In addition to those disability requirements, we also have other requirements that veterans must meet in order to reach grant approval, and those include residency. So feasibility and suitability that I mentioned for our previous grant is not, is based on residency in this case, meaning the veteran must certify that he or she will reside, excuse me, or intend to reside in the housing unit. The ownership requirement here is similar, but because veterans are allowed to adapt a family member's home using this grant, either the veteran or the service member must have ownership, or the family member must have ownership. Pardon me, excuse me. There are no minimum property requirements for the Special Housing Adaptations Grant, so we don't have minimum property requirements. What we have instead are recommended adaptations. We have a list of adaptations that we recommend for veterans based on the disability that they have that made them eligible for this particular grant. Both of these grants can be used up to 3 times, not to exceed the aggregate amount of assistance. So those maximum amounts that I gave you earlier, veteran, for instance, the SAH grant, the veteran can use that 3 times up to that $73,768. So if the veteran used it once, pardon me 1 second. Sorry about that.
So the veteran may use the grant, let's say he used it one time, up to $50,000, they would still have a remaining entitlement for that grant. So that those maximum amounts that I discussed earlier can be adjusted annually based on the Turner Construction Cost Index, and we look at that for the previous 4 quarters when determining how much the grant may be increased each year beginning on October 1st. The statistic that is here on this slide I mentioned earlier, so in fiscal year 2015 we approved over 1,800 grants which represented over 80 million in grant funds, which was a 100% increase over fiscal year 14. Most of our veterans use the grant for remodeling an existing home, but grants can be used to assist with the purchase of new construction or purchase an existing home that has been adapted. Veterans that own a home that has been adapted may use grant funds to reduce the principal balance of their mortgage as well. The third aspect of this that I mentioned earlier was our temporary residence adaptation grant, which is based on eligibility for the first 2 grants that I discussed, meaning the specially adapted housing grant and the special housing adaptation. So veterans, in order to use this temporary grant, veterans must be eligible for one of those other 2 grants. The key for the temporary grant is temporary doesn't describe temporary use of the funds. What it means is that the veteran will be residing temporarily with a family member, and temporary is the key word there. An example of this might be a veteran who has recently returned from combat, has been injured, and is being discharged from one of our medical facilities. And this veteran may not be ready to purchase a home or enter into home ownership, but will be residing with a family member, a mom or dad, while they figure out what they're going to do, while they decide whether or not they want to buy a home. So what this grant allows us to do is to adapt that family member's home to make it accessible for the veteran while they are residing there. The TRA grant can only be used once, and it is counted as one of the 3 allowable uses, but beginning in August of 2013, it's not deducted from the total maximum grant amount. So if, for instance, a veteran moves in with his parents after his or her parents after he or she is discharged from the medical facility, they can use, in the case of a SAH grant, they can use up to $32,384. If at some future point they decide to purchase a home, they would still have the full amount of the SAH grant available to them for use. So the basic steps in the process for the veteran obtaining these grants, and I think Shantaria, yes, she displayed that. So I'm going to, on the right side of your screen, you'll notice 2 web links, actually a file and a web link. One is the www.ebenefits.va.gov and VBA or VA form 26-4555. So there are a couple of ways the veteran may apply for this benefit. First is if they have an eBenefits account, which is a web-based portal for veterans and their family members to manage their benefits. They can log on to this website, and there is a link for veterans to apply for the SAH or SHA benefit. The other is the veteran can fill out this form 26-4555, and they can apply either through their local Veteran Service Center at the regional office or through their local regional loan center, and Loan Guarantee Service will process that application. So it's important to note too that the Loan Guarantee Service, which administers this benefit, does not make decisions regarding entitlement. The veteran will file a claim through the Veteran Service Center, and they will complete a rating decision regarding entitlement and notify the veteran of that decision. If they have not been granted entitlement, the veteran has a right to appeal that through the Veteran Service Center. Concurrently, the VSC also notifies Loan Guarantee Service regarding that entitlement, and that's when the veteran's case comes into Loan Guarantee's wheelhouse. So we have approximately 150 specially adapted housing agents spread across the country, located at 8 regional loan centers, and cases are assigned based on geography. So the specially adapted housing agent that is most proximate to the veteran that has received entitlement will handle their case. And so the SAH agent will actually meet personally with the veteran in their home to discuss the process and provide support and guidance to the veteran throughout the entire process, from getting the grant approval all the way through the management of construction. The agent will also work with the veteran, the family members, builders, in assembling the necessary documents, such as plans, specifications. On to grant approval. Once the grant is approved, funds are available for disbursement. We typically place the grant funds in an escrow account. VA or loan guarantee will ask one of our compliance inspectors, which we have a fee panel of independent compliance inspectors across the United States, and prior to dispersing funds, we will ask this independent inspector to visit the property to ensure that that particular stage of construction has been completed according to the plans and specifications. And once we receive that verification, we'll disperse the funds to the contractor. And our program is a work equal pay program, meaning we don't disperse funds in advance of work being completed. But once we have verification that the work has in fact been completed, we will disperse those funds. And at the end of the project, we will send the specially adapted housing agent back out to the property for one final inspection to ensure that both the project is complete and that the compliance inspector has done a proper job of inspecting the property throughout the project. Once all of the funds have been dispersed, the agent closes the case and ensures that all of the funds have been accounted for properly. One unique feature of this program, and I mentioned this earlier, that veterans do have multiple uses of the SAH and SHA grant. Let's say a veteran uses all of their funds, all $73,768 at one time. In subsequent years, if the grant does increase and the veteran has uses available to him or her, they may apply for what we call a subsequent use of the grant. So if the grant goes up $5,000 or $6,000 in a subsequent year, those additional funds are available to the veteran if they have remaining uses. On our next slide is, I mentioned earlier, our 8 regional loan centers, and this is a graphic showing where our 8 regional loan centers are located. And each regional loan center is attached to a regional office. We do have one final poll question, and Shantaria, if you could go ahead and post that as I provide some contact information for everybody.
All right, so the poll is now being displayed on the screen. Before the Q&A session, but after hearing the information presented by Rob today, do you plan to further investigate the use of and/or incorporate the VA Specially Adapted Housing Program into the range of service assistance provided to veterans that you serve? And so the tallies are coming in. Looks like the majority of participants are planning to do it, but they're going to investigate a little further. All right, and
Okay,
so
great.
I'm going to get it in that poll.
And on our last slide is a web address for our loan guarantee webpage. You can find information about VA home loans as well as the specially adapted housing program, and also my contact information. I'm happy to, we're going to certainly have a Q&A session here in just a moment, but if you want to email me directly, please feel free to do so, and I'm help you in any way I can.
All right, so Rob, we are actually going to move into the Q&A session. Rob's email information will be provided as part of the handout material, so no need to quickly hurry and try and write that down. It will be available on HAC's website following the webinar. And so I'm going to jump right into the questions here. We've got a question from Sharon, or more comment/question. She's been told that by a veteran that they could not apply unless their doctor approved them for it. does a veteran need a doctor's approval to apply for the specially adaptive housing grant?
No, they do not. And I would urge that veteran, if they think they may have the, some of the disabilities that would entitle them to entitle him or her to this benefit, to certainly apply. When the Veterans Service Center receives an application, they will adjudicate that claim, making reference to the veteran's existing medical file. So they will do a thorough investigation of the veteran's medical condition and their disabilities in making that rating decision.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to the next question. Jeff wants to know, what other funds do veterans typically use with these type grants?
Could you repeat that one more time? I'm sorry.
What other funds do veterans typically use with these grants? So say they're trying to finance a house that's $200,000 and their SAH grant is $73,000. What other funds do they typically merge or include with these funds to?
Good question, and that brings up a good point. One of the requirements of the program is that if the cost of the project exceeds the maximum grant amount, we do require proof that the veteran has the funds to cover that portion of the project, whether it be liquid funds or if they are obtaining a construction loan. Sometimes veterans work with nonprofit organizations that contribute funds to the project. We've seen that. We work quite frequently with nonprofit organizations across the country that assist veterans in covering the cost of the grant that exceeds the grant amount.
Right, perfect. That's actually a perfect lead-in to Mark's question. Mark wants to know, what would be the role for them as a nonprofit regarding this particular program? Would they just refer the veteran to VA, or how does the nonprofit get involved?
Sure. In many ways. The veteran may already know of the program. If the nonprofit organization certainly may refer the veteran to us to assist. Excuse me. My apologies. I'm having a tough time today talking. But certainly the nonprofit can refer the veteran to us, and we can assist the veteran with applying for the benefit. If the veteran has already received entitlement for the benefit and comes to the nonprofit, then the nonprofit will most likely start working or begin working with the specially adapted housing agent that is assigned to the case. A couple of years ago, we had a forum here in Washington for nonprofit organizations that have worked with our program in the past, and we hope in the future to have another forum to educate nonprofits about our program and how we work collaboratively with nonprofits to deliver the benefit.
Perfect, thank you. You are just leading yourself right into these questions here, Rob. Janice wants to know, what is the VA's goal in working with nonprofit service providers? So in essence, what is the best approach, or what role can the nonprofit play to better serve veterans?
It varies. I will say that some of the nonprofits that we work with contribute funds, and that is the limit of their involvement. Other nonprofits work with, they actually construct the homes, or they may identify a veteran who has a need, who may be qualified for this benefit, and we use those funds in conjunction with the funds from the nonprofit organization to ensure that we have a well-constructed adapted home. So hopefully I answered that question well enough. If there's a follow-up, I'm happy to address it.
All right, perfect. William from out at Western Maine has a similar question. As a community action doing home rehab for veterans, what is the best way for them to leverage the funding with those available to them? And that might be something that William can email you about specifically. It seems like that one might need a little bit more discussion. So do you want to just follow up with William after the webinar on that one, Rob?
Shantaria, this is Elysium. Is this the program they have up there to do the energy efficient improvements to homes up there?
If I'm not incorrect, it sounds like it. I know Western Maine does do a lot of the energy improvement.
Okay, so Rob, then do you feel like you could comment on, whether or not we can use SAH grant funds to do things like that?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, my connectivity cut out, so I did not hear the last part of that question. But um, you know, there are situations where we can use grant funds for features like that. However, as I mentioned earlier, with regards to minimum property requirements, those first must be satisfied. So if there are funds available after the minimum property requirements have been met, then we can look at things like some energy efficient features or using installation of maintenance free materials that make life easier for the veteran.
So, yeah, in other words, then, if the veteran is wheelchair bound, but there's no ingress or egress for a wheelchair into the house, our funds would have to go to those items first before we could entertain any sort of energy efficient improvements.
Right, exactly. We first have to meet the statutory purpose of the program.
Yeah. So I'm not sure, William, if that answers your question or not, but if not, yeah, just please email us. We're glad to help.
All right, great. We will move on to the next question. James from Habitat out in Smith County, Texas, wants to know: are there veteran income restrictions?
No, there are no income restrictions. This is a benefit. So the only factor that we do review and analyze is whether or not that the veteran has sufficient income to continue to own and maintain the home. And we look at expenses only related to the home, meaning mortgage, utilities, taxes, maintenance, things of that nature.
All right, thank you very much. We have a question from Erica from Sales out in West Virginia. She wants to know, are there grant funds available for honorably discharged veterans who do not have a service-connected debilitating disability?
There are, but not under this program. This program requires a service-connected disability, and I described the eligibility requirements earlier in the presentation. But through through the prosthetics and sensory aids service over at the Veterans Local Medical Center, they offer a home improvement and structural alterations grant, and I believe it's a very small grant. I think it's up to $2,000 for non-service connected disabilities. So it doesn't go nearly as far as this program does, but they do have that available for non-service connected disabilities. It also has a service connected component, I believe, and that grant maybe goes up to $6,800.
All right, great, thank you. Janice wants to know, are there resale restrictions on the units once the SAH grant funds have been included in the unit?
No, there are no resale restrictions. However, once the veteran has used their benefit, whether they're they may or may not be eligible for it in the future, meaning if they've maxed out the number of uses and their maximum grant amount and they decide to sell their home, the benefit is not restored. So it's limited again to 3 uses and up to the aggregate amount of assistance available.
Okay. Let's see. I think we have one additional question, and it's, how is the VA doing its outreach to veterans with regard to this program?
Good question. Well, we work frequently with our veteran service organizations across the country, with nonprofit organizations. We, as I mentioned earlier, we have 8 regional loan centers and 150 specially adapted housing agents across the country who interact with veterans and veteran groups. We have information available on the web, and we frequently represent
loan guarantee service at other veteran events around the country, such as the wheelchair games, the winter sports clinic, and in those locations we assist veterans who think they might be entitled to the benefit with applying for the benefit.
All right, perfect. I think you might have answered this question already in the presentation, but I'm going to ask it again since it's come up in the queue. What is VA's definition of suitable as it applies to rehabilitation of an existing home? What model or building code does VA use to govern its suitability standards?
Right. We don't really refer to a building code, but what we do, what we consider suitable, is it physically possible to adapt the home? Is it possible to adapt the home to meet our minimum property requirements? And factored into that is the cost of those adaptations, and that in many cases is a decision for the veteran. So it may be suitable to adapt a home within the maximum grant amount. In other cases, it may not be. The cost of the adaptations could significantly exceed that amount, and the veteran may choose not to move forward with adapting that home because of the cost. But suitability refers to the physical possibility of providing those minimum property requirements. And I'll provide an example. We've had situations where we've had we do provide a lot of new homes or work with veterans who are building new homes. And if you're building a home in a area that has significant grade changes, maybe it's on the side of a mountain, it may not be the most logical place to build an adapted home. However, when we look at the site that's relatively level, where we can incorporate those minimum property requirements into the structure, then that is what we would consider something like that more suitable. But it's handled on a case-by-case basis, of course.
All right. Melanie also wants to know, and she's saying that this might have already been addressed, but what is the maximum grant amount again?
Sure. The maximum grant amount for the SAH grant, which is our larger grant, that's the grant that deals with veterans who have impaired mobility, that grant is $73,768. And the temporary component of that grant, so a veteran who is residing with their family member temporarily, has $32,384 is the maximum amount for that. Our smaller grant, which deals primarily with veterans who have impaired vision, that maximum amount is $14,754. And a veteran who is residing temporarily with a family member and is eligible for that grant may use $5,782. And as I said earlier, those amounts are tied to a construction cost index, and we analyze those late summer each year as we're going into the new fiscal year to determine whether or not we are going to have an increase on October 1st.
All right, so the next question is sort of like a lead-in from your answer, or a tie-in to your answer. What is the cap on the amount of grant funds for the SAH program each year? I think you mentioned before that there is a maximum number amount, but what is the amount?
I mean,
this is Alicia. There's not a maximum pool of grant funds every year. Congress doesn't appropriate a flat dollar amount. It's how it's funded is into an account where, it's kind of such funds as necessary. If we have 2,000 veterans next year that require us to fund a grant that year, we fund them.
All right, perfect. Well, that actually answers the next question that came in, because Janice also wanted to know was how much funding is available under the SAH program for grant making, but that explains that, and so that ties.
Yeah, it's a little different than regular grant funds where there's a flat dollar amount that they give out to a certain number of participants. We fund the projects. If they meet our requirements, they're funded from Treasury.
Right, and I think I have one last question, unless another question comes in while I'm asking it. It's they want to follow up on the resale restrictions. So at no point does a veteran have to repay any portion of the grant funds, even if they get the grant and move within a short amount of time, or resale within a short amount of time.
That's correct. This is a veteran benefit. It's not a it's not a loan. It is a benefit that the veteran, if they receive entitlement, they are eligible for this benefit.
Right, great. So Amy, who looks like she's going to have the last question of the day, unless someone gets behind her, is there an administration fee for the SAH agent? Is there an administration fee available for SAH agent? I'm not quite sure.
I'm not sure either, but no, I mean there are no additional administrative fees. I mean, our specially adapted housing agents are employees of the VA, and that is their job, to assist veterans and work with our external stakeholders, which are builders and architects, engineers, to provide this benefit for veterans.
All right, so that was our last question that we had in the queue. Are there any other questions out there, any other burning need-to-know questions before we let Rob and Elysium off the webinar today? We're going to give you guys maybe another minute or so. You might be drafting your questions now, but in case there are no questions, want to go ahead and do a quick reminder before we wrap up. The recording and the materials will be available on HAC's website, www.ruralhome.org, shortly following the call. Also, please be on the lookout for an email containing a link to your certificate of participation, as well as a link to the webinar survey. That is the way that HAC knows that we are bringing to you the most relevant information that's applicable to your program. Oh, and we do have some questions that have come in. Let's see. We have a question from William. He wants to know how have the funds been distributed across the country?
That's a good question. Go ahead, Alicia.
Rob, do you want me to take that one? And the
Sure.
only reason I say that, it sounds like your mic is cutting out again. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We don't have a distribution by, geography. Wherever a veteran resides, if he or she is entitled to the benefit, and, like Rob explained, we determine that you can adapt the property and all of the good things that go along with that, then the veteran's eligible. If the question is more a sense of, where do most of these grants cluster, Rob, I would have to defer to you on that.
I would say that most of these grants cluster on the coasts, and on the East Coast and the West Coast. I mean, we have, I would say that also our regional loan centers are strategically placed, and those are usually, if you refer to that map that we had in our slide, those would probably be a good representation of where most of our eligible veterans reside, and historically where we've provided the grant in the most cases.
We also have ability to do these grants internationally. That's probably not a salient point for the audience today, but it was something interesting. We're seeing a lot of vets overseas who are in need of the grant as well.
All right. I think we have two additional questions that have come in. James from Texas wants to know, is a nonprofit able to get reimbursement for soft costs and admin costs of assisting veterans with the SAH grant application?
If it's a cost that's directly related to construction, such as overhead, then usually that cost would be built into the overall project cost, and that is a possibility, but it has to be directly related to that specific project.
All right, and last question, Jeff wants to know, is there a certain region or group of veterans that are underserved by this particular grant program?
To my knowledge, no. I mean,
Rob,
I think we have a...
Yeah. Go ahead, Rob. I'm sorry.
No, it's just to my knowledge, no, we have an equal distribution of staff across the country, and as Elysium said, we've even expanded our coverage to include veterans who reside outside of the United States. And Elysium, do you have anything to add there?
No, I don't. I mean, I wouldn't say there's an underserved, market or area of geography for this program. We have the ability to shift staff around if need be. If we see, a groundswell of cases coming in a certain area, I mean, the RLCs are very adept at handling the increases in volume. So it's not that, veterans are sitting around waiting to get help for any inordinate amount of time. The international cases prove a little bit difficult in terms of travel funds, and scheduling trips to go out there and, catch in all of the new veterans that need the assistance. But we're on top of that as well, I believe.
Right.
Right. So one additional question. How is your coverage in rural areas, or I guess the more direct question is, do you have any statistics, or are you able to say how much of the SAH grants are awarded in rural areas or granted in rural areas?
Shantaria, that's an excellent question. I don't, and Rob, trump me if you have something in your Rolodex. I don't have any figures about that on hand, but much like we segregate our guaranteed loan data into rural and urban demarcation, we could do the same with the SAH grant volume. If anyone is interested in having that information, please let Shantaria know to where we can send it. It'll take us several weeks to get it together because it's slow here, but we can get that data put together for you all.
Thank you, Elysium. Looks like that is the last question that has come in for today. If there are no other questions, again, please be on the lookout for your emails for that certificate of participation, as well as the link to the survey. And at this point, I would like to thank both Rob and Elysium, our VA partners, for the wealth of information provided during today's webinar. I'd also like to thank each of you again for joining us for today's webinar. Elysium, Rob, would you like to add any further comments before we end?
It was a pleasure being here, and thanks for asking me.
Yeah, same here, Shantaria. Thanks everyone for listening today and for caring enough to help veterans.
All right, thank you both. Having that be the last word from Elysium and Rob, thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.